Good morning, everyone. My name is Hali Rubera, and I'm from Nairobi. I'm a senior studying political science and Africana studies. And today it is my pleasure to introduce to us Dr. Alison Head. Dr. Head has a PhD in library and information science from the University of California at Berkeley, where she also received her BA. She is a senior researcher at the Meta Lab at Harvard University and a visiting research scholar at University of Pittsburgh. In 2017, she was awarded the inaugural ST Lectureship in Library Leadership and Innovation from Harvard Library. From 2011 through 2015, Alison was a fellow and faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Her research about today's students and their information practices began with a small study at St. Mary's College of California, where she taught new media as a Roy Disney visiting professor in new media for 10 years. She is the founder and executive director of Project Information Literacy, a research institute that studies what it is like to be a student in the digital age. In a series of 10 groundbreaking research studies, PIL has investigated how college students and recent graduates utilize research skills, competencies, and strategies for completing coursework and for solving information problems in everyday life. I read her research paper and I found that the results were so interesting because it felt like she was describing me. So some of the some of the findings that resonated include 80%, that's 8 in 10 of the students that PIL surveyed in 2010 reported having overwhelming difficulties with getting started on research assignments and determining the nature and scope of what the instructors required of them. Like those in describing that one finding, they also mentioned that the students couldn't even figure out what a thesis statement would be for their research paper. I was like, that's me. And then across all PIL surveys, students tremendously underutilized librarians. They're not in the room, it's fine. 8 out of 10 of the respondents in PIL's survey reported rarely, if ever, turning to librarians for help with defining topics or researching for sources when working on course-related research assignments. And a large majority of the US employers that PIL interviewed in 2012 found that the students were technology savvy, but these employers were dismayed to find that most of these college hires were tethered to the computers and rarely went beyond a Google search and the first page of results looking for the answer to a workplace problem. That's me. Anyway, so I had mentioned earlier that she works at the Meta Lab at Harvard, and I really encourage you to look at their website. She's a senior researcher at the Meta Lab, and one of their areas of research is art and AI, and the projects in this area explore the psychological and philosophical realms of electronic systems, reflect on the long history of human fascination with thinking machines, and consider our uncertain moral reckoning with the agency and autonomy of computers. The title of her talk today is the Parkland Generation Tuned In? News, Authoritarianism, and Democracy in the Age of Factual Recession. I'm excited to hear her speak. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Head.
Thank you. Well, you did a lot of research. I'm impressed with her research skills and her candor. About this study, I was interviewed. I haven't told anybody this, of course, it's taped now. Can we delete this part? But along the lines of librarians, I thought he was young. He told me he was 25. And I said, you're kind of the age of the student I study. He said, oh, that was ancient when I graduated. I graduated when I was 22. And he went on to say about librarians and whether students turned ever to librarians for news sources. He said, isn't that kind of like asking your barber for help with a research assignment? So not good news for librarians. So what I want to talk to you about, I'm very, very excited. I want to thank you for your very thorough introduction. Thank you. That's probably the most thorough introduction I've had ever. But what I want to talk to you about today is news, and news engagement, and news seeking behavior, and you. And your particular demographic. What's really exciting to me about this talk is that some of you may have been in the study. Do you remember taking an online survey or a follow-up interview? Is there anybody that was in the study that participated? You did. Did you talk to me? I think you may have, because I was the Wellesley follow-up interview. Okay, I'm going to violate your privacy then today. Okay. It's a total violation of the IRB, which is at this institution, thanks to my good friend Talkies. So I'm going to talk about that study, actually. I won't single you out and talk about your responses. But it's interesting to be able to talk to subjects of a study. There were 394 Wellesley students. The total sample was 5,548 or 84. Okay, let's start with a broad statement here. I love this overview from Mitchell Stevens. It's a really really useful book. Not useless. It's a useful book about the history of news. And what he sums up is that news it's interwoven in our lives. It's always something that we've wanted to know. It's just not now. It's not in the 20th century. It's really something that's always been a matter of survival, a matter of knowing about your village and your people. He cites historically, even back to 1920, when travelers would go to Outer Mongolia, the first thing that people in Outer Mongolia would say in their pre-literate society was, what's new? What's going on in the world? This is something that's part of our lives. We hear so much talk about how social media is addictive, and certainly for your generation, where people get their news. But even in the 1940s, when newspapers went on strike, at that time, people were interviewed in one study and said, I can't go on without the news. So this has always been something that has been part of our lives, who we are, and who we are as a primal, really, need. The study that I conducted with Talkies, actually, and two other researchers from Northeastern and somebody from my research institute looked at news engagement. But what we were curious when we started the study, I remember Talkies, I said, I'm interested in news engagement, how students find news, and as Talkies said, and how news finds them. And it's true. I mean, this is the other piece here, I think, is how students contribute to news content, something that's unique for this generation and have a role, whether that's through sharing or posting comments or posting accounts of news themselves. So here's a look at the news engagement study. You can see Wellesley on the map here. Nearby also was Brandeis. I wanted to emphasize schools in a couple of different ways when I selected the sample. I wanted to have a mix of red and blue states and representation. There was a small sample from high schools where we really could tweak the sample. And one school, for instance, was in the middle of Montana, where a lot of students got their news from Fox News. So we really worked with the sample to get that variety. But the other thing that we wanted to include was we wanted to have representation from schools with large Hispanic enrollment, Hispanic serving institutions. Diversity, of course, has come to mean something entirely different. Beyond representation from people of color, we also wanted DACA students and sanctuary schools in the sample. So we had some representation there as well. And we also didn't want Ivy elites. We also wanted schools with specific interests like Brandeis, but then huge publics that had many interests represented on their campus, Michigan, for instance. But then we also had some schools where they drew students from their nearby community a lot, like Oklahoma State, where they had such a small representation from out-of-state students. What we did in this study is we asked 3 research questions to kind of frame it up. As I said, Wellesley accounts for 394 of the sample. The overall sample is 5,844. We've got 205 students from high schools. As a point of comparison, I'll give you the punchline. Were high school students that different? They weren't from college students. Just a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we asked 3 questions. We could have asked many, but we asked 3 questions that we wanted to know about how students engage with news. The funders, Knight Foundation, American Library Association, their question was, ALA in particular, are students newsless? That was one question, but it really wasn't one of our research questions, because I had done early focus groups. I had done a study in 2010, and the top everyday life need that students had was news. So again, falling through with Mitchell Stevens' thread here. So we knew that to be true. So we asked 3 research questions. The first one being, what constitutes news for someone your age? What is news? How do you think about news? And how do you define it? You define it very differently as the first generation, really, to experience news through social media. So this definition has changed. Also, the rise of memes and political memes. It comes out really high in our results. When I presented at ALA, that was the finding that got the attention. There was a huge line of questions when I showed the meme slide. And I thought, oh no, I'm in New Orleans, how am I ever going to get home? I really didn't want to, Takis and I talked about this, I didn't want to be known as the meme study because we had found so many more useful things. So the first question was much broader than memes. It really was, how do students engage with news? What does news mean to them? The second question was, we had somebody that was an expert in social media and journalism, and the question we wanted to ask around social media was, how do students engage with social media to find news and to share it and to retweet it or whatever platform they might be using? The third question was much more from my perspective, kind of from information science. And that is, how are authority and currency changing? I mean, these are things that we never thought would change. But authority and who gets to speak and who gets to talk has dramatically changed, or who gets to tell news has dramatically changed, even in the last 10 years, if you think of the rise of digital journalists. The other question is currency, something you never thought would change. But currency, again, with this onslaught of so-called breaking news, when often it's the same story. So what is currency? How do you, something that bothered and really concerned Wellesley students, the ones I interviewed, was being current, knowing the story of the day. How do you resolve these things as a news seeker? So these were the questions we started out with on the study. We did some pre-focus groups because I thought, in framing up the research questions, how are students thinking about news? Kind of cheated the survey a little bit to really inform the kinds of questions we asked. And one of my favorite quotes was from a student at a community college who said, a foreign student actually, and he said, you know, it's harder to not stay current than to stay current today. So really feeling being inundated, and also the pressure of having to process that news and be smart with your friends and others, as well as in class. So here are 5 research takeaways from the study that Haley told me that it sounds like her. This may sound like you. It would be interesting to hear. I often don't get to lecture to my subjects, so this is really kind of fun for me. So tell me if this sounds like you. The first one, and this was somewhat of a breakthrough, 67% of the sample, that's over 2/3, were what we called multi-modal, in the sense that they had gotten their news from 5 platforms, at least 5 platforms in the last week when we asked them in an online survey. And here's a list of the different platforms that we asked them about. We called these like Pew and also American Press Institute. We kept the same language and called them pathways to news so that we could include peers as well as traditional pathways. And what we found is the cynics in the crowd. I think often what my studies do and the Research Institute does is they debunk these thoughts about today's students, people like you. You're not apathetic. You are seeking news. You are clever in the way that you seek news. And what we found here is that social media did not top, it's close, but it does not top peers. The importance of exchanging news. I remember interviewing a student from Wellesley, and she said, I need to know the news before I meet my friends in the morning, because that's what they're going to be talking about. And if I don't know the news, I'm kind of out of it. You know, I don't have anything to say. And this was a scramble. You could look at your Apple News and find out what the top headlines were, but you sure didn't want to show up. And at the time we did this study, there was a lot of talk about Kim Jong-un and missile testing. You do not want to show up and say, the Kardashians, the planning for Meghan and Harry's wedding. You know, you really needed to know the news. A place like Wellesley and other college campuses is a serious place. This expands what news is. News is also for learning. It really affects your learning with your friends and others. The other finding here that I think is significant to talk about in relation to your world is the impact of professors and instructors and your news consumption. This is a list of frequencies of where students had gotten their news in the last week, and 7 in 10 said classrooms. And what's interesting about that is professors often don't know the impact they have on students in those kinds of discussions, especially today in thinking about news. We interviewed somebody from a community college. This is a pretty compelling story. First generation, community college, and she says, when we talked about news in class, I didn't even know there was something called fake news. And the professor and my classmates started talking about how you could look at news and evaluate it. And I can use this in my other classes. I can use this in my life. So that's somebody at the other end of the continuum who's not a sophisticated news seeker. And that discussion changed her life. Where in other classes, often discussions with professors with somebody more seasoned, perhaps you, brought their attention to an issue that was going on. Myanmar. What's happening in Myanmar? What about ethnic cleansing? What about election meddling? What is going on? As well as hearing from your peers, not just the professor, in as far as argument and debate, and not just one side of an issue. And this is a very powerful thing to understanding news. The second finding that I think is significant here is around social media. 57% of the sample had shared in the last week. Okay, that's an interesting statistic. We always think of the cynic, the person that says students are apathetic, they don't vote, they don't care about the news. What would they say to that? I think what that statistic does is it points to the fact that students aren't always sharing. And I think there's this misconception that students are always, tweeting the latest so-called news, whatever that might be. And what we found is not are they only not always tweeting, what they're doing is they're being very circumspect and very careful about what they do tweet. And again, you see, they don't want to worry about their reputation being at risk, often with their friends in their peer group. One student from Wellesley that I interviewed said, I shared something and it was totally inaccurate. And I met my friends and they went, oh God, I can't believe you shared that. Everybody knew that wasn't true. And then she said, yeah, I look really carefully now. God, I felt really dumb. And there's nothing worse than feeling dumb with your peers. And that had a certain reputational cost to it. So what the slide really explains is how students evaluate news in a way that when they share news, they evaluate news carefully, more carefully than you would think. Or perhaps, I don't know if you do these practices. Do you do some of these practices? Do you share news? Are you critical about the news that you share? And is your motivation to share news to promote in a custodial role, in something that's a stewardship, that somehow says, this is important for my friends to know about. This is something I think that they should know about. This is very different than sharing to provoke. So again, you see this. The other part is the keen evaluators that I was just talking about. They're being very careful about what they do share. And these students checked how current the information was before they shared it. You get almost 2/3. And then also reading the story from beginning to end. That's kind of surprising. But a number of students, a majority, more than 50%, say that they do. The other red square here, the 52%, this is a really interesting behavior. This is what your composition teacher wanted you to do as a researcher, maybe from high school, maybe in college. And what they do, a number of students, is what's called lateral reading. They'll compare one story with another story, sometimes even for fun, where students in focus groups or pre-focus groups talked about, I'll take a news story and then I'll look on YouTube and see if the person really said it that way and what the context was. I'll take a news story from the New York Times and compare it to Fox News. Because that helps me understand the range of the argument. So this lateral reading, not only is it a good practice and a critical practice, but it also helps us understand how your generation defines news and what it is. News is work. News isn't a leisure activity. It's not buying the 4-pound New York Times and dragging it home on Sunday, the newspaper, and like when I was in college, and you say, hey, did you read the book review? That was really great. I hope I have time to read that book. It's much more interactive, engaging. You're using the device that will allow you to make that comparison. That's something that is new about news. And because of the increasing quality of disinformation, the fear of fake news, disintegrating online content, this is almost something that's necessary if you really want to know something. At the same time, a common student complaint was, the whole story's not here. News is fragmented. Not only is it a hodgepodge of information in bits and pieces that you get, the whole story's not there. You're not sure of what the consequences are. The other concern students talked about was every story feels like breaking news. A tragedy. Kate Spade, she kills herself, commits suicide. It's a sad story. She made nice handbags and really had an amazing career. She kills herself and it's treated like breaking news. It's, you see it and you're like, oh my God, did you hear Kate Spade killed herself? And you follow that lurid story about her divorce with her husband, suffering from depression. This is somewhat of a private story, quite honestly, about her life and the demons that she struggled with. In the old days, that would have been treated like something in the New York Times, because that's where she lived, a full-on obit on the obit page that said, this woman had a remarkable career. But instead, all stories are treated like breaking news. And this is where you see this foundation of this seminal part of democracy, something that you're looking at this winter term, really disintegrating under this kind of pressure. The other piece, and you touched on this, Hallie, the other piece here is that students are inundated by news. And so they tend to be very selective. I love this quote from a student who says, it has to affect my life that's what prompts me to click. And it's got to be affected somehow. It's got to be tied into my life because there's too much news. The formula, when I asked a student at Wellesley, what's the formula of sorting through all that news? And she said, we do have a formula. It's the News Digest. And I said, what news digest do you follow? She said, New York Times. I was like, yeah, right on. You know, it's probably pretty honest reporting. And she said, oh, and BuzzFeed. And you thought, oh, So anyway, so there's this need to, what is the most important story? But as far as following serious news, it's really tuning out the rest. This is kind of astounding. If you look at the last category at the bottom, sports falls at the very bottom of the list. For women and for men, a male-tracked activity, leisure activity, if you look at the research around that. And what is at the top is traffic and news, which is practical and something you need to see every day in your life. Kind of ordinary. How do you dress for the day? What's the temperature in a place like this going to be? And yesterday was 40, today was 16. It can vary, as you well know. But the second is national government and politics, is what they're selecting, the kinds of news. And we'll talk more deeply about that in a second. Also, what was fascinating is, and this really addresses the Parkland generation, students, whether they were majoring in education or a field that could be related to education, were following education news. And during the interviews, our follow-up interviews, and the write-in comments, 1,600 write-in comments to this survey, it was really, they wanted to know what was going on about the March for Our Lives, the student walkout, gun violence. At the same time, race and immigration. Gallup did a study around the same time and found that this was the major concern that all Americans have. This was the story they were following. So that shows some continuity. You're following the stories, but you're also following stories that are pertinent to your age group. Here's the last finding here. This is a surprise to me. Students really felt somewhat betrayed about the news these days because of the influx of disinformation, poor quality, uncertainty. They really held the values of journalism, independence, accuracy, fairness. They held those values very high, but it felt like they were hard to find. They were hard to find in the influx of news. So at the same time, if we're talking about democracy in a large way with this winter session, what we find is actually some good news. Students find that following the news, knowing the news, is essential to a democracy. A number of them also find that it's important and part of their civic responsibility. This is great news, but they're also overwhelmed. And given you're a student, your time is limited as far as how much time you can find sorting out the news. These are optimistic findings about students today. CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Learning Engagement over at Tufts, finds there's all this worry and hand-wringing. Will students show up for the midterm elections? Will they make a difference in perhaps maybe one of their first elections that they vote in? And sure enough, 10% more did this last election. That's a midterm election. So they're up to 32% from 22% in the midterm election in 2014. That's good news. That shows, that's data that actually supports and shows that students are following the news, they're voting, things are moving well in a democracy. At the same time, even though our findings are optimistic about students' behaviors, at the same time, you can't help but notice the destabilizing effects that are going on with news and democracy in the country and at large in the international sphere that you're interested in looking at this winter session. Let's talk about this. We asked a question that the American Press Institute asked in their study about how millennials find news. They asked it in 2015, and they said, how'd you get your news in the last week? And you find, from my slide here, it was 43% of students said, I followed political news in the last week. We asked our sample the same exact question. Different group of students, different group of millennials, not really millennials anymore, and it's up to 89%. So that it more than doubled the kinds of news that you're following, political news, and the importance. What this tells you is that political news is dominating, at the expense of other news, what you're receiving. News about your town, news about schools and violence. And the nature of that news is really coming from the president. The president has, for lack of a better word, hogged the megaphone for news and getting news out. 41% in a study that was done at Harvard over at the Shorenstein by Tom Patterson. I've got the sites on the last page if you want to look at them. In a study that he did, a professor there, he looked at the first 100 days of Trump in office. And what he found was that 41% of the news coverage was about Trump. Of all the news coverage on print and also TV. So you can see the shift. I mean, there were days, even with Obama, there were days where he wasn't in the news or making news. This is not our reality anymore. You can't even say that you have a 24-hour news cycle. You have a millisecond news cycle that you're dealing with right now. So Trump, to look at these figures another way, and what Patterson does, is Trump has gotten 3 times more coverage. Of course, he makes news as well. And if it's slow, he tweets and creates news. He's gotten 3 times more coverage than any other president, ever. This is a significant change. This destabilizes the discussions and the nature of the discussions that we're having about politics. It pushes people, well, Pelosi's actually getting a lot of coverage now. But it pushes other issues out of the way, intentionally, often. And this is important to look at and to know. Of course, we know this is a common story in the news. We know that what Trump is saying is not entirely accurate, and that's an understatement. This is a really cool site. It's on the Washington Post. It's one of the political fact-checking sites. If you don't know about it, check it out. It's also cited. But since he had been in office, and this ends on December 31st last year, 7,645 claims that are inaccurate. You see it kind of increasing per his different issues that are happening. You can also look at by topics, if you want to dig down deeper into the topics that you're studying. It's a pretty fascinating and scary piece of information to have. So not only is he sowing confusion, it's chaos. The news cycle's constantly moving quickly, and it's, as we know, look at this and not this. The Wall and not Mueller. So it's a shell game in a lot of ways. The other thing, and maybe this is the most important slide for the work that you're going to be doing, and that is authoritarianism is on the rise. There's a resurgence of authoritarianism. And these are the kinds of themes, whether you watch Rachel Maddow, whether you watch Fox News, Fox and Friends, these are the issues that are being churned and talked about. Look deeply at these issues and how they're covered and ask yourself, why are we spending time on these? Why are we moving the discussion more towards authoritarian types of conversations that inherently divide? There's a great piece, I know you had Cass, did you have Cass Sunstein yet from Harvard come in? Okay, you must be coming in at a different time. He's over at Harvard Law School. He wrote a book kind of a twist on Upton Sinclair called Authoritarianism, Could It Happen Here? And got a group of different essays from people around the world, actually, to contribute. Karen Stenner, who's a political psychologist with a specialty in authoritarianism, writes a great essay with Jonathan Haidt. And how they define authoritarianism is this movement towards oneness and sameness. She's Australian, and she talks about how in the US, this is very dangerous, as well as on the world stage. Well, what's this really mean? At the center, and she's talking about the US, is this discussion where fear's at the center. This is, this could happen. And often economic stability is a way for authoritarianism to work really well in this country. These are some of the themes that we're all familiar with, especially around the wall. And then we see political actions that are related to them. The fear of immigration and the other, whoever the other might be. Could be transgender one week. It could be Muslims the next week. You don't know. It's a moving target. Right now, this talk actually, as it's occurring now, what's happening in politics is it's not only the discussion, it's the effect it's having, the wall, and the fact that the country's being held hostage at this point around the wall. Not sure what your politics are, but I can kind of imagine. The other thing is this erosion of cultural identity and the diversity within this country, that's actually being questioned when this country was actually founded on a very different precedent, a very different basis. Climate change and discrediting scientific claims, opinion over fact. This is a huge transition here, that opinion matters more than fact. It's not just scientific claims, it's also scholarly claims. And how this isn't working. Kind of this boomerang effect, or this effect that this has, is not only is there the discussion, you also see Trump pulling out of the climate summit. When you want to look at the erosion of cultural identity or strife, you see the Muslim travel ban. So they are leading to action. It's not just the discussion I'm concerned about in the news, it's the action that's being taken. Gun control and fears of terrorism, arming elementary school teachers and high school teachers, probably not the best solution. And you see a movement, you don't see law, you don't see action yet. But this is very concerning, the religious and ethnic minorities in this country as well as not responding. The shooting of the synagogue in Pittsburgh, there's a delay in the response. The fires in California, where I live, Trump didn't even come to Sonoma County, where I live. There's no recognition of it. So it's not only what's done and what's told, the important thing is what you're not being told and what's happening in the news and being ignored with another agenda over here. This is powerful stuff. At the same time, we see this demonized press, which we're all familiar with because of Trump and the tweets, and the New York Times. Really, it used to be the paper of record when I was in journalism school, is known as the enemy of the people, quote unquote, from Trump. This is a really interesting slide. If you think about democracy, you think about the press and about their role and the importance of the press and its watchdog function to keep people in power in line. And also to talk about how taxpayers' money is being spent, but also the kinds of decisions and laws and legislation that's being made. You see this incredible divide between how Democrats and Republicans feel about the importance of that watchdog role. This gap is getting bigger. Republicans, on this chart, 38% thought the watchdog role was important. 82% of Democrats thought it was important. This is the political polarization slide to a T. Here's where you are with your winter session. I wanted to touch on something and talk about the data we got from students, but also talk about what it means on a national level. And then here's my international slide, because I looked at the different topics that you're going to be discussing and the solutions and trying to, I guess, in Albright language, make sense, come up with incremental change. This is a pretty powerful chart from Reporters Without Borders. And I love this chart because it shows, as a measure, the freedom of the press worldwide. And if you see the dark section, where it's very bad, with the black, is a big part of the world where a number of people live, and it's expanding. If you see the countries on the other side where it's very good, Norway and Scandinavian countries, and then over in the Western Hemisphere, it's Costa Rica and Jamaica. It's not US. Part of the reason this is happening is because of our country and the current conditions stepping back from a leadership role for the importance of a free press. And this is significant. If you don't believe the consequences, and I think you do or you wouldn't have been accepted to this program, but in the last week, these slides were really hard to prepare because things are always happening around the freedom of the press. I was constantly changing the gray box. Most recently, the 2 journalists in Myanmar. Who has Myanmar? And the Rohingya. And the ethnic cleansing. I won't spoil your presentation and give it away. But 2 journalists, young journalists, idealistic journalists, are jailed. Their appeals denied. They're in jail for 7 years now for breaking the Rohingya village story about atrocities and ethnic cleansing of Muslim people in Myanmar, formerly Burma. Egypt. Who's got Egypt? Okay. Well, welcome. You have the country where there are more killings and violence towards journalists than any other country in the world. The numbers are not real high, but it's scary. And it's really scary who has Brazil as Bolsonaro comes in, which was just this last month, who's pledged to tighten up on the media. This may look very different next year. We all know the grisly, I won't go into details, Jamal Khashoggi death in the Saudian consulate in Turkey, yet another thing that throws press freedom into a worldwide crisis. And China, who's got China? That's a really interesting group because you almost have another theme that I haven't talked a lot about, but this theme of authoritarianism and technology. What China has decided is that they have surveillance technology that they've developed, and they're now selling it to 65 Middle Eastern countries and in Southeast Asia. So fake news and surveillance has become something that could be monetized and could be profit controlled. This is not a shift of, gee, I'm worried about our times. This is a shift that's in play, and it's going to be very difficult to unwind. So how are students? I'll bring it back to you. You've got the global, you've got the national, you've got your school and how you're living every day. How are you impacted by these larger issues that are happening with the freedom of the press? Well, here's my sad stick figure. And the overabundance of news, the flooding of news, is a serious problem. Not only is it a hassle on your phone when you look at Apple News, or when you try to find out what's current before you go see your friends for coffee. What happens is it ends up leaving you uninformed and pretty darn ineffectual, unless you drop out and just follow the news, which none of you are going to do. When we did our survey, 51% of the sample said, and these, remember, are the optimistic news seekers, only 8% did not look at the news. So that means most students were looking at the news, and 51% of that sample said, I can't tell the most important story of the day on any given day. That's shocking. That really tells how uninformed all of us are. I have the same problem. If you look at your phone after this talk, there's going to be a news story. So we're all in that boat. It's not just you. The fake news phenomenon. We see this changing. Now we see journalists being prosecuted for fake news on a worldwide level. I mean, this is the Myanmar and how they were able to wedge that. You see other cases of it internationally. This is more than, if you thought election meddling was bad, if you thought the person sitting in their garage coming up with stories that were untrue just to get eyeballs and to make money, if you thought that was bad, and that was at the beginning of this study, it's actually getting worse because fake news now is a basis or something that can generate court actions, and again, the tightening of a free press. It's not, I'm not here as a downer, but it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And you have a chance to change that in some way, in a small way, the incremental change that the Albright upholds and talks about. But with fake news in our study, and back to you, what we found is 36%. Seems like a small percent, but that's a third. That's more than a third of the students who followed news. A third of them felt that fake news really threatened and impaired their ability to tell the credibility of news. And so they distrusted all news. And what that leads to is being distrustful of news, the role of a free press in this country, worldwide, and eventually tuning out because it's just too much. You just don't know. The ultimate study here is, and when I was on the plane, I heard someone say it, that's around my age or younger, that is tuned out. You're not tuned out. So you really are the hope here. Let's talk about seeds of change. These may apply directly, they may not. I know you're looking for a lot of material for helping to solve the different problems that you'll face in your teams as far as the countries that you're focused on. To wrap up the study, we looked at 3 ways forward with news and news engagement in this country, because we were looking at a US sample. First, this is a serious problem, and a lot of solutions happen within education. And K through 20, if there needs to be more teaching, what we talked about, we called it knowledge in action, for dealing with different types of information and emerging media. Probably the most interesting distinction between high school and college students that we studied is high school users' growing use, not of Facebook, of Snapchat for news. News is, the sigh. You thought political memes were bad. So Snapchat is increasing. News is becoming more visual. It's also becoming a lot more brief. It's also becoming a lot more of entertainment. And that's the generation behind you. If you want to be grumpy one day and go, oh, those kids, look backwards and think of the Snapchat generation. That's one issue. So there needs to be, not faculty as well as students need to be engaged more in how information is changing and the skills that are needed for a moving target. And then secondly, social media. A lot of concerns about social media, but as it applied to this study, we talked about the need for more responsibility with news aggregators. I've already told you that students look at news digests, but where's that content coming from? Is it coming from algorithms? Is it coming from algorithms that are based on how to generate more dollars and more eyeballs? So there needs to be a closer and more serious responsibility to create algorithms that give reliable news, especially to people like you, that really are serious and dedicated news seekers. Next, we talked about journalism. Journalism often leaves out a lot of people. If you want to, it's an old criticism that's been around since the 1960s. There are certain stories. There have been studies about How are African Americans portrayed in news? Often in a very negative fashion, as somebody that commits crimes, that is a fugitive at large, and then of course you have African Americans that are rap singers and that make a bunch of ridiculous amount of money, or that are athletes and make a ridiculous amount of money. And there really isn't the telling of not only African Americans, but people of color and people in general, minority groups, what their world is like. This is something that journalism, if you look at it in mainstream press, is scrambling to get at because they've missed that mark. They're so far behind, and they know it. The other thing is what's called, this is an up and coming movement, look for these stories as the news hole shrinks, but look for these stories for what they call, journalists call, solutions journalism, where not only an issue is covered, but the solutions to it, how to remedy the problem, and look deeply, almost like a 20-page term paper that you would give. That kind of coverage doesn't exist. That in the past has been a role that journalists really didn't need to do, and it's now being developed. Back to Karen Stenner. These are her seeds of change, the piece in the Cass Sunstein group of essays, and I think everybody agrees, whatever you call it, the less airing of public, different sides of political conflict, reaching across the aisle, working together, where we don't see good examples in government. And we often don't see good examples elsewhere. This has become a phenomenon that has extended. It's extended not only at high government levels, but also in everyday life. And again, that growth of the other. I found this so interesting from an Australian perspective in Stenner's essay, talking about you have to realize that neighborhoods in the US are pretty darn segregated. There are neighborhoods where, where's your Chinatown? Where do Asians live? Where do African Americans live? Where do Muslims live? In different areas of neighborhoods and towns and cities across the country. And even though we like to say we don't believe in segregation and we have certain laws, this is something that's really the structure. Think about your own town. It's unusual for those walls to be broken down. And what she said is to fight authoritarianism, as an expert in it, to fight authoritarianism, what we need are how you destabilize authoritarianism is to have unifying rituals and to bring together these neighbors and these different neighborhoods with common causes that they're all feeling in different ways. And some examples of that, and what's now becoming a ritual, is the Women's March, which became international. And you can say, there was some division with groups, but for the most part, women came together, and people came together, and kids came together, and people that had never marched for a cause to bring those issues, whether you're talking about Planned Parenthood or you're talking about different issues that women face. This is something that unifies a country and a group and a globe, and it's grass seeds. It's this grass seed movement where a woman's that's young, around your age, a little bit older, is feeling really disenfranchised about Trump winning. And she organizes on social media this movement. Probably even more profound is the March for Our Lives. It's unimaginable, if you think about it, that a high school student would put that together after Parkland, bring that together, and it brought that issue to the front page and took that space. And that was very powerful. And these are the kinds of things that you can do for seeds of change if you have, or a way forward. And the other is, and I've touched on a couple of these in the slides, is the more and more sites, I don't care if it's Snopes or the political fact-checking on the Washington Post, or done by the New York Times, or an independent group like the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. These kinds of organizations where facts can be shared and substantiated are essential, as well as realities. And those are some ideas. I know that you've got a heavy lift in front of you, and hopefully this will be of use. The last thing, I've talked a lot about free press. This is a great piece that was on the Freedom House in New York, and it's not just freedom of press, it's also free and fair elections that are at risk, and the rule of law. Thank you.